The glaring, bright yellow sheet taped to our front door made my blood boil. It was the 5th violation notice this month, all concerning Elena's ramp. I crumpled the paper up and tossed it into my ever-growing collection of Karen's official warnings. I could hear the sound of Elena's electric wheelchair steadily making its way up the ramp behind me, a sort of unsolicited love note from our overly critical neighbor. Elena asked with a tired smile, the dark circles under her eyes betraying the exhaustion from her new job. She never complained. Not about work, not about the car accident that forced her into a wheelchair 6 months ago, and certainly not about Karen's relentless harassment. You'd think that being HOA president would keep her busy enough without obsessing over our home, I muttered as I watched through our kitchen window. There was Karen, standing in her driveway and snapping pictures of our ramp with her phone. Even though her perfectly highlighted hair and designer workout attire were on full display, nothing could hide the look of pure malice on her face. I recall the day we installed the ramp with crystal clear detail. We followed every regulation in the book. We hired a licensed contractor, obtained the proper permits from the city, and even matched the exact shade of gray paint to our home's trim. Yet Karen arrived before the concrete had even dried, waving the HOA rulebook as if it were a magical wand. Section 8, paragraph 3 clearly states that all external modifications must be approved by the board, she had declared with feigned concern. We have to maintain our property values, she insisted. What truly set my teeth on edge was how Karen kept scheduling the meetings about our ramp at times when Elena couldn't possibly attend. Not that she could anyway, since she was busy running the state. Yes, my sister isn't just any homeowner. She is the governor. We had kept that fact under wraps in the neighborhood to preserve her privacy during her recovery. Just last week, I caught Karen outside at 6 a.m., measuring the ramp with a tape measure. When I confronted her about it, she claimed she was simply fulfilling her duty as HOA president. From that moment on, I began documenting every single detail. I recorded videos, saved every notice, and maintained a detailed log of every interaction, certain that these records would soon prove invaluable. That morning, as I helped Elena into her car for a physical therapy appointment, I noticed Karen huddled with 2 men in suits near her house. They were pointing at our ramp and gesticulating dramatically, one of the men scribbling notes into a small notebook while the other took additional pictures. I don't like this, I confided to Elena. Maybe it's time we let them know exactly who they're dealing with. Elena shook her head and replied, I'm not going to use my position for special treatment. We'll handle this properly through the official channels. Yet, even as I watched Karen's triumphant smile while handing thick manila envelopes to these men, I couldn't shake the feeling that following the rules might not be enough this time. I pulled out my phone and began recording, catching Karen's voice carried across our yard on the gentle morning breeze. Yes, we'll need that bulldozer here first thing tomorrow morning. The board has already approved the removal. My heart nearly stopped. They couldn't really be planning to tear down a wheelchair ramp, could they? As Elena's car disappeared around the corner, I rushed inside to check our security cameras and retrieve our folder of permits. What I found in those files would change everything. A discovery that would soon make Karen wish she had never meddled in our business. Later, while I was eating breakfast, the low rumble of heavy machinery outside our house made my spoon clatter against my bowl. I bolted to the window, and my heart nearly stopped. There stood Karen in our front yard, clad in her signature red blazer and with her perfectly styled blonde hair, pointing fiercely at our wheelchair ramp, while a man wearing a construction hat nodded in agreement. I immediately grabbed my phone to document the scene. The morning sun had barely risen, and most of our neighbors were still asleep, yet a bright yellow bulldozer loomed in our driveway with its metal blade gleaming menacingly. 2 workers in fluorescent orange vests were measuring the ramp with bright yellow tape, while Karen clutched a stack of papers to her chest as though they were pure gold. I called out in a voice that trembled with anger, "What do you think you're doing?" Karen's face lit up with that insincere smile she always wore at HOA meetings. "Oh good, you're home," she chirped, walking toward me in her designer heels that sank slightly into our freshly cut grass. "I have here an emergency order from the HOA board declaring that this structure is in direct violation of community guidelines, section 4.23. She waved a paper in my face before swiftly pulling it back. I took a deep breath, recalling the calm composure Elena had instilled in me during her campaign speeches. "Karen, we submitted all the proper paperwork. We have approval from the city. The city isn't the HOA, dear," she retorted, her smile never faltering. "As president of the board, it's my duty to maintain our community standards. This ramp is an eyesore that's lowering property values and clashing with the neighborhood aesthetic." At that moment, the bulldozer revved its engine, and I felt my stomach drop. I pulled up the property maps that Elena had meticulously saved on my phone, maps that clearly outlined our property lines and the permits. "This is illegal," I exclaimed. "You can't just demolish someone's property without proper notice or a court order." But Karen just laughed, a high-pitched, unsettling laugh that made my skin crawl. "Notice was given 3 weeks ago via certified mail. We have the receipt right here," she said, producing another document with a signature I didn't recognize. I frantically dialed Elena's number, but it went straight to voicemail. Of course, she was in that closed-door budget meeting again. I tried reaching out to her assistant, her security team, everyone I could think of, but nobody answered. Meanwhile, the construction workers began placing bright orange cones around our driveway. One of them appeared uncertain, checking his paperwork repeatedly and whispering to a colleague while pointing at something that just didn't seem right. I warned them firmly, "If you do this, you'll be hearing from our lawyers. This is a blatant violation of the Americans with Disabilities Act." I started live streaming on my phone to capture every detail of this injustice. For the first time, Karen's counterfeit smile faltered, even if only for a split second. "The HOA is not exempt from federal law," I shouted, my voice echoing so loudly that nearby houses flicked on their lights. Our elderly neighbor, Mr. Rivera, peeked from behind his front door before retreating hastily at the sight of Karen. But Karen had already turned toward the bulldozer operator, giving him a sharp nod. The machine roared to life, its treads crunching against our driveway, and I watched in horror as its massive blade lowered toward the ramp we had worked for so long. "Last chance, Karen," I called, steadying my phone as I recorded. "You're making a huge mistake." She turned back toward me, her eyes turning cold despite the lingering false smile. "The only mistake here was allowing this monstrosity to be built in the first place," she countered. "Sometimes people need to learn that rules exist for a reason." With a terrible screech of metal on concrete, the bulldozer's blade caught the edge of the ramp, and I continued recording as chunks of our carefully constructed ramp began to crumble. What Karen and her cronies hadn't noticed was that Mr. Rivera had returned with his own camera, and more neighbors were gathering, phones raised, capturing every moment. Just then, my phone buzzed with a text from Elena's head of security. "Stay calm. Keep recording. Help is 3 minutes away." I smiled, the first genuine smile that morning, as I watched Karen orchestrate the ramp's destruction like a conductor leading an orchestra. So focused was she on her imminent victory that she failed to notice several black SUVs turning onto our street, or the distant sound of approaching sirens. Sometimes, the biggest mistakes come from the smallest oversights, like not realizing that your seemingly ordinary neighbor is, in fact, one of the most powerful people in the state. Karen was about to learn that lesson the hard way. I'll never forget the moment our quiet suburban street transformed into a scene from a movie. Just as Karen was busy high-fiving her compliant associates over the successful removal of the eyesore, the first black SUV rounded the corner, then another and another. Red and blue lights began flashing everywhere, and my hands shook as I hit the record button on my phone. Karen's expression shifted from smug satisfaction to sheer confusion as 3 state police cruisers pulled up, followed by 5 identical black government vehicles. Neighbors who had been watching furtively through their curtains now spilled onto their front lawns, every one of us sensing that something monumental was unfolding. "What is all this?" Karen demanded, her voice cracking with uncertainty. In that moment, the street fell deathly silent as Elena's lead security team stepped out, scanning the area before opening the back door of a central SUV. Then, as if on cue, my sister rolled out in her wheelchair, dressed in her official governor's blazer, and sporting the stern expression normally reserved for major press conferences. "Actually," Elena's clear, commanding voice rang out, "this is no longer a private neighborhood matter. It's a state matter. The moment you violated federal disability protection laws, you crossed a line." She wheeled forward, her security team moving in perfect formation around her, and added, "Not to mention, you are now in the process of destroying state property without authorization." Karen's face shifted through a whirlwind of emotions, fear, disbelief, anger, in just a few seconds. "State property?" she squeaked. "Yes," Elena continued, pulling out her phone. "Would you like to see the deed, or should we discuss the Americans with Disabilities Act first? I'm particularly well versed in Title II, having just signed new state protections last month." The crowd of neighbors grew larger by the second, with at least a dozen phones raised to record the drama. Across the street, Mrs. Carmichael had already gone live on Facebook. Karen attempted to cling to her reliance on the HOA bylaws, but her protest faltered as Elena interjected sharply, "Interesting you should mention those." At that moment, Elena signaled to her assistant, who stepped forward carrying a thick binder. "My legal team has been reviewing your HOA's bylaws all afternoon. Would you care to know what we found?" I watched as members of Karen's HOA board began to quietly back away. Multiple violations of state housing laws, discriminatory practices, and irregular financial records dating back 3 years. Elena paused for dramatic effect, eliciting gasps from the crowd. I zoomed in on Karen's face with my phone as it turned as pale as the violation notices she adored. "This isn't... I didn't know," Karen sputtered. "I was the governor," Elena finished for her, "and bulldozing a disabled person's access ramp without proper notice or permits is a federal offense." 2 state investigators stepped forward, notepads in hand, as news vans began pulling up at the end of our street. "Mrs. Thompson," one investigator said, "we'll need you to come with us to answer some questions about today's events and these financial discrepancies." As Karen was led away, still mumbling incoherently about property values and outdated HOA bylaws, Elena turned to address the assembled crowd. "My fellow neighbors," she began, seated in her wheelchair amid the rubble of our once pristine ramp. "Today, we have a chance to redefine what community truly means. This isn't just about my access to my home. It's about every person's right to live with dignity in their own community." The expressions on the faces of those gathered reflected a mixture of shame, anger, and, most importantly, a newfound sense of unity. As I watched Karen being escorted toward a police car, still clutching her beloved rulebook, I couldn't help but wonder what would become of our once peaceful neighborhood after this explosive evening, and how many other HOAs out there were employing the same tactics that Karen had used for years. The morning after the bulldozing incident, my phone buzzed incessantly. Our security camera footage had gone viral overnight, and news vans were already lined up outside our house. But that wasn't even the most astounding part. My old high school friend, now a civil rights lawyer, called with shocking news about Karen's previous HOA violations. I couldn't believe my eyes when I opened the files he sent over. Karen had been sued 3 times before for similar stunts in other neighborhoods, yet she always managed to settle quietly and move on to terrorize a new community. This time, however, she had picked the wrong house on the wrong day. Elena, being the remarkable governor she is, didn't just get angry, she got organized. She immediately called an emergency press conference on our front lawn, with pieces of the demolished ramp still scattered behind her. Reporters swarmed as she presented a stack of documents that proved Karen had not only broken federal disability laws, but had also violated 17 different state housing regulations. And then something even more astonishing happened. One by one, our elderly neighbors stepped forward. Mrs. Lee from across the street recounted how Karen had forced her to remove her medicinal garden. Mr. Rivera produced documentation showing that Karen had fined him for installing a wheelchair lift for his veteran father. And even the once quiet Baker family shared how they'd been threatened with fines for setting up sensory-friendly playground equipment for their autistic son. The neighborhood I had known for years suddenly felt transformed, a place where people were now talking to each other, sharing their stories, and standing together. Karen attempted to call an emergency HOA meeting to defend herself against these outrageous accusations, but no one showed up except for her two most loyal board members. Meanwhile, Elena had invited disability rights advocates to our home, and nearly half the neighborhood turned out to learn about accessible housing rights. Just when it seemed things couldn't get any more intense, someone leaked Karen's HOA financial records. It turned out that she had been using the fines collected from residents to pay for her own home renovations, all under the pretense of board-approved community improvements. The HOA's lawyer resigned on the spot, and 3 board members tendered their resignations via angry emails that soon found their way into the local news. Karen, however, still wouldn't back down. The next morning, she showed up at our house with a cease and desist letter demanding we stop spreading lies about her. What she didn't expect, though, was to walk into a meeting already in progress between Elena and the state housing commissioner, who was very eager to review every decision Karen had made over the last 5 years. The look on Karen's face when she realized her reign of terror was crumbling was almost worth all the ensuing drama. The best part, though, was watching our neighbors rally. One by one, they began putting up signs promoting accessible housing until Karen's house stood alone, isolated by its outdated policies. News helicopters circled overhead, capturing every moment, and by sunset, our story had made national headlines. That evening, as more neighbors gathered on our lawn to share their stories and to plan for a new inclusive HOA, I couldn't help but wonder how a single wheelchair ramp had sparked such monumental change. Yet the night was not over. Elena had just received intriguing documents connecting the bulldozing company to Karen's own private contracting business. The next morning, I woke up to hundreds of messages from neighbors sharing their own HOA horror stories. My phone buzzed nonstop with reporters wanting to interview us about the day's events. But what caught my attention most was an email from Mrs. Rivera, our elderly neighbor, whom Karen had fined the previous month for displaying a garden gnome. She had evidence of even more lawbreaking on Karen's part. I spent the whole day printing out every single HOA rule and meticulously highlighting the parts Karen had blatantly ignored. Elena's legal team even discovered that Karen had never properly filed the paperwork to become HOA president. She had simply taken over when the previous president moved away, and no one had dared to challenge her authority. The more we uncovered, the more damning the evidence became. Then something remarkable happened. Our story reached Tony Lin, a famous YouTube lawyer known for exposing unfair housing rules. He flew in to meet with Elena and offered to help us sue Karen and the HOA free of charge. His video on our case garnered millions of views in just one day. In a final desperate move, Karen tried to salvage her image by calling yet another emergency HOA meeting. But this time was different. Instead of her usual sparsely attended meeting room with only 2 drowsy neighbors, the community center was packed with residents who had never spoken up before. They shared their own stories of Karen's bullying. Mr. Donovan even showed pictures of his daughter's treehouse that Karen had forced him to tear down. And the Wilson family recounted how Karen had condemned their bright Christmas lights as too garish. Then Elena took to the microphone. She didn't just address the ramp. She revealed her grand plan. I have been working on a new law to protect homeowners from HOA abuse, she declared. It will be called the Right to Home Happiness Act. The room erupted with cheers. The final blow came when our security footage revealed that Karen had lied on official documents to obtain permission to bulldoze the ramp. 2 days later, her own lawyer dropped her case. We watched as Karen packed up her prized row of bushes, the same bushes she had once forced everyone else to emulate and relocate. The new HOA board was nothing short of transformative. They converted the old violations office into a community help center, replacing fines with welcome baskets for new neighbors, and even starting a program to help elderly residents with home repairs. Elena's ramp was rebuilt, but better than before. Local artists had painted it with vibrant murals of flowers, and soft, enchanting lights now made it glow gently at night. Kids in the neighborhood even began calling it the prettiest thing on our street. Last week, Elena hosted a neighborhood barbecue in our backyard. As we gathered to share food and laughter in the very spot where Karen once stood ranting about grass height rules, I realized something profound. Sometimes the worst moments lead to the best changes. Even the bulldozing company, once the instrument of destruction, now offered free ramp installations to disabled residents throughout the state. Their CEO personally apologized to Elena, and they even established a scholarship fund for students pursuing studies in disability rights law. The biggest surprise came yesterday when I was promoted to run the state's new Homeowner Protection Office, my first task being to show other neighborhoods how to transform their HOAs from bullies into genuine helpers. Elena declared that this was only the beginning, and judging by how much had changed in just 1 year, I believed her. Our story even made it into school textbooks as a shining example of standing up against unjust regulations. But the true victory wasn't measured in headlines or new laws. It was found in the little everyday moments. It was in watching Mr. Rivera's collection of garden gnomes grow bigger each week, or seeing children play freely in their front lawns without the constant threat of violation notices. Karen's old house was sold just last week, and the new family, with 3 kids and 2 dogs, already has a wheelchair ramp installed for their grandmother right in the front yard. Instead of complaints, 5 neighbors showed up to help them move in. In that moment, I knew we hadn't just changed an HOA, we had changed our entire community.